Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar entitled The Top 5 Mistakes in Selecting a LIMS. Before we get into the content of today's presentation, we'd like to take you through a brief summary of what we're going to cover in today's session. We'll do a brief welcome and introductions and take a moment and tell you a little bit about Astrix Technology Group so that you understand who we are and why we feel we have the right to talk to you about the topics that we're going to address today. We'll do an evaluation of what the top 5 mistakes are when selecting and implementing a LIMS, talk about the ways that those can be fixed, and then also go through some life case studies to go through some of those specific examples. As I mentioned, we'll also go through a Q&A, and as we go through today's session, I encourage you to ask as many questions as you like. Please use the question function on the GoToWebinar panel. When we get to the end of today's presentation, we won't read your name or your company. We will just read the question out loud and do our best to answer it. If we don't get to your questions in time, we will create an FAQ PDF document to send out along with an on-demand version video of today's session, along with a PDF copy of today's slides. So briefly, before we introduce our speaker and get into the content, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who Astrix is. First and foremost, we're an informatics professional services company, but also a staffing company that is completely dedicated to the scientific community. A few quick statistics about who we are and our origins. We were established in 1995. Today, our privately held corporation. We actually originated as an IT division of APBI, which was a $300 million life sciences research organization. Today, Astrix Technology Group operates from 8 offices and has greater than 500 employees, with our headquarters in Red Bank, New Jersey. We have 2 primary divisions, a staffing division which offers private and public sector staffing of predominantly scientific and IT resources. We also operate a professional services division. That's the division that's presenting today's content, which is focused on supporting science-based organizations in a variety of different ways. The type of companies that we work with are life science enterprise, government research institutions, large and fast-growing IT, staffing, and compliance needs being one of the primary drivers with which people contract with Astrix. The mission, to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. Briefly, about the industries and the technology partners that we focus on. Anything with highly regulated workflows and integrations, any pharmaceutical, biotechnology, personal care and consumer products, cosmetics, petrochemical, these are all organizations within industries that we operate. You know, you could simply say anybody with a lab, but these are the primary industries in which we operate. Now, there's certain technology platforms that we also work with on a regular basis, and these are going to be kind of a who's who in the laboratory informatics and LIMS space. You have Thermo Fisher, Waters, StarLIMS, Dotmatics, LabWorks, Core LIMS, and LabVantage. Basically, our professional services group, who's responsible for delivering LIMS systems implementations, post-implementation training, integration services, as well as selection of the LIMS, helping companies determine the right way to go about selecting a LIMS for their organization. We partner up with a great many organizations that understand a great many solutions on the market in order to bring what we bring to our clients. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Robert Walla is a principal and co-founder of Astrix Technology Group. Mr. Walla is ultimately responsible for the growth and strategic direction of the overall professional services division. And he brings with him over 20 years of experience in lab informatics, including overseeing very large global informatics projects. He comes to us with a BS in chemistry from Rutgers University. And Robert, I'd like to welcome you and pass control over to you.
Kevin, thanks so much for that introduction. And again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. A little bit about what to expect today before we get into it. Obviously, we're going to identify and talk in detail about the top 5 mistakes that we see when companies go through a LIMS selection process. And we'll give some pointers on how to avoid those mistakes. We'll talk about a couple of case studies on where we saw those. And then, as Kevin had mentioned, we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. And if we don't get to everybody's questions, as Kevin had mentioned, we'll certainly develop an FAQ and have that sent out. But before we get going into the topic, I think, Kevin, you have our first poll of the day.
We do, and these are very helpful for us to not only keep the content focused on the audience, but also helps us plan other webinars. So the first one is, tell us a little bit about your current role within the laboratory. So we'll go ahead and launch that poll. We'll keep it open for just a few minutes. Basically, we want to get an understanding of who the audience is today, and certainly Robert can adjust and kind of maybe talk through a little bit from the perspective of the audience once we have that understanding. We'll launch a few more polls as we go through. Typically what we do is we'll launch them and leave them open for about 10 or 15 seconds. So we'll do probably a countdown of about 5 seconds from here, and we'll wrap this and then we'll share the results. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close that poll out. And we'll share those results real quick. So our audience today is made up pretty evenly between lab managers and LIMS users or administrators. That's great. We also have analysts and executives on the call today. So we appreciate your attendance, and we'll go ahead and keep going.
Great, Kevin. Thanks so much for that. Okay. Before we get into actually speaking directly about the 5 mistakes, let's take a step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the LIMS project in general. And the first thing I want to touch on is really characteristics of a LIMS project to kind of set the base for the presentation today. So really, when you look at a LIMS project, what makes up the characteristics of it? First and foremost, and maybe more importantly, is certainly there's a financial component of it, right? Typically, a LIMS project would be one of the largest purchases that a laboratory is going to make. And there's typically a wide span. On the smaller end, for small laboratories, you're into the hundreds of thousands of dollar range, and it can certainly go to $1 million plus. But obviously, it's all relative, right? But the point here is that it is a large capital expenditure, maybe one of the most the largest that a laboratory is going to make. In addition to that, LIMS projects will have a high impact on lab operations, and really from 2 standpoints. Certainly during the implementation of a LIMS system, because there will be people that are in the laboratory, doing day-to-day work that will have to be part of the project team and part of the implementation, so that'll affect the lab operations. And then during the implementation, whenever you start to use a new system, it does have an impact on operations. LIMS, as you probably can imagine, will touch a lot of parts of the organization. We also always kind of look at it from a lab-centric standpoint, and that's a big part of it, obviously. But we'll also impact and touch IT, quality, management, and maybe other parts of the organization like manufacturing. So a lot of people will be involved in this. LIMS project, they have high expectations, for right or for wrong. Right? When you're going to do an implementation, there's a lot of excitement. The LIMS will help improve efficiency or make our quality better or drive the finances, whatever the goals are. And it really has a very, very high expectation when people get involved in it. And often, for people involved in it, it can be a career-defining moment and an opportunity. Often we'll talk to people when we get involved, and the leader of the project or maybe the manager of the division will say, hey, if this goes well, this will look good for me, or this will look good for my organization, and it'll put us in good light with the company. So, there's definitely some personal gains that could be made during a LIMS project. But really what this boils down to, when you really look at it, is that LIMS projects come under a lot of scrutiny. We're often told, hey, when we get started, hey, this project has a lot of eyes on it. And, it makes sense, right? Because you're spending a lot of money on it. It's touching a lot of parts of the organization, high expectation, so it's just natural that it does come under a lot of scrutiny. So what's the outcome of a typical LIMS project? Not necessarily what a lot of companies want. A generally accepted number, and this could be Googled, or if you talk to people in the industry, it's about 50% of LIMS implementations fail. And sometimes we even hear higher percentages of that. But when we say fail, what do we really mean, and what are we talking about? A couple of different things. It could mean that a LIMS was implemented without all of the required functionality, and that happens a lot. And that's usually because companies and people will run out of time, budget, or patience, or a combination of all 3. A failure could also mean that the project did not meet targeted goals or objectives. For example, if a LIMS was implemented to drive efficiency or improve quality or reduce the amount of errors, and over time that's measured and that's not met, it could be seen as a failure. What we see a lot is grossly missed timelines and budgets. So this is typically where somebody outlines that we have 6-month timeline and X amount of dollars, and now you're into the 18-month time frame and 3X, and that happens. And that's typically a reason that people will consider a LIMS not going the way it should and be considered a failure. And not often, but what does happen is sometimes a project is just canceled outright. Right? There gets to a point where a company will throw their hands up and says, this isn't working. Let's stop it, let's go back, rethink, and regroup, and maybe we'll start at some other point in time. But the important thing here is maybe not what does a LIMS implementation failure mean, but really why does it happen? And we could probably spend this entire hour here, 15 minutes, going through why LIMS implementations fail. I'm going to list a couple of them here. Typically insufficient resources is a main one that we often see, and that's insufficient resources either from a vendor perspective, okay, where if you hired a vendor, you bought their product and they did not put enough resources on it, or it may be from the laboratory's perspective where they thought they were going to be able to put X number of folks on it and it just didn't turn out that way, and the project went on and on and on, or did not include all of the features that was required. A lot of times projects just get off on the wrong foot and they start with bloated scope, meaning that the company's trying to boil the ocean with what the LIMS can do and the features that they want in there, or maybe the scope is just misaligned either with what the vendor can deliver or the time frame, for example, that has been allotted. And then there's some more tactical things where you just poor project management or you just don't have the right project team. But these three things, if you really think about it, it focuses on the implementation portion of a LIMS. And as I said, we could spend a lot of time going through. There's many, many, many more of these. But a lot of times projects are really destined to fail from the beginning, even before implementation. And it really comes down to that the organization selected the wrong LIMS system. So before the first project kickoff meeting, before a core team is formed, even before you write the first check to the vendor, okay, that project was just destined to fail because you don't have the right tool. And we're going to spend today talking about the main reasons why that happens. But I think at this point, Kevin, we have another poll you want to put up?
Yeah, we do. We'd like to understand maybe where the audience is in their LIMS life cycle. So we'll go ahead and launch this, and it's tell us a little bit about the status of your LIMS. Do you currently have one, or you have and you're not going to replace it? Do you plan to purchase one in the next 6 to 12 months? Do you not plan to purchase one, etc.? So it gives us a sense of where folks are. Obviously, and we appreciate you taking just a moment. We'll leave this open for just a few more seconds as we gather up the results, and then we'll share those. We'll close the survey out, close the poll out in about 3, 2, and we'll close it. And then we'll go ahead and post these results up for everybody. So 38% currently have a LIMS. There's some plan to replace in 6 to 12 months. We do see that quite a bit because there's certainly a lot of legacy systems in the market, and certainly with the advent of cloud technology and the level of integration that you can achieve with cloud technology, that's something that a lot of CIOs are certainly taking a hard look at. So we appreciate that. We'll go ahead and close these out as well and pass it back to you, Rob.
Kevin, thank you, and thank you for everybody for voting. So let's look at the first one, and we're going to take number 5 first. Yes, this will be a countdown, Letterman-esque, so to speak. So the number 5 top mistake in companies make when selecting a LIMS is buying solely on the recommendation, okay? And what we mean by that is that it is a suggestion from a colleague or a friend, either that you work with or that's in your line of business, okay? And it's usually starting out as a conversation, maybe very informal, where you say, hey, hey, we're looking to buy a LIMS. What are you guys using? And they'll say, oh, we're using vendor X. We like it a lot. It's a good LIMS. But really what it comes down to, it's a very qualitative assessment. It's based solely on their experience with this and in their organization. Now, the ironic thing about this is that, buying on a recommendation is somewhat natural or personal personally. I recently bought a TV, and I know nothing about electronics really, but my brother does. And I said, hey, I'm looking for a TV. What do you think? And he just went on and on about, LG versus Samsung versus Sony and 4G and smart TV and all of this, and made a recommendation. And I think we all do that to a certain extent, whether you're buying electronics or a car or you want a recommendation for a bottle of Chardonnay. But with a LIMS system, it doesn't always work that way. Typically, what the outcome is that you kind of get an anecdotal recommendation, right? It's not really based on anything, scientific, but, just the likes or dislikes of the person that you're talking to. More often than not, you're going to buy a system that will work well with your friends, but not necessarily for your laboratory. And it will most likely not meet your specific requirements, again, because it was not really done on any evaluation according to your organization. So how do you avoid a mistake like that? And what we recommend to our clients is that establish an evaluation process that focuses on your company, your organization, your laboratory. And there's a couple of different aspects of this. Go through and take a little time and establish what really the goals and objective are of your LIMS system. What are you trying to accomplish with the implementation or replacement of a system? Evaluate your current processes. Make sure that that's documented so you know currently what you're doing and how you may want to change that. Document your requirements. Very, very, very important. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. You make sure that they are documented and documented properly. Develop an evaluation plan. Sitting in a tavern across, having a cocktail with a friend of yours, talking about what LIMS may work may not be the best evaluation plan. There's better ways to do that. Seek assistance if needed. If you don't have the experience, internally or don't have the time, reach out to people that, really understand this market and the proper way to do it. You'll save yourself a lot of headache in the end. Okay, number 4, beginning with insufficient budget. One of my favorites. And really what we talk about here is that it kind of is in reverse, where a budgeting process took place before an organization really understood what their needs were. And we often hear, well, we went to management, we asked them for money, but this is just a plug-in number for budgeting purposes. Well, I've developed a lot of budget. I've been held to a lot of budgets, and plug-in numbers become actual numbers pretty quickly, and that's usually what happens. So that maybe pick a number, $100,000 that was supposed to be sort of a thumb in the air, that quickly becomes the number that now you have to deal with. And really, what you run into is that your project now is constrained by some arbitrary number, however you arrived at that. Because typically it's not, you did not arrive at that by doing any sort of evaluation when you're starting with that budget number. So really the outcome of this, a lot of times you select the lowest cost LIMS or close to lowest cost LIMS. That may work out, a lot of times it does not. So what you wind up doing is cutting scope. And in our experience, the scope that's cut is most of the scope toward the end of an implementation, because that's when you start to run out of money. And a lot of that is very, very, very important, if not the most important. We often see testing getting squeezed or training either not happening, or maybe they'll send one person to training. And when you look at it, you'll spend maybe months doing a configuration or some sort of build out of the LIMS, and then you spend a week testing it. Typically doesn't go very well. And what often happens is that the implementation or the big level of efforts gets shifted to the laboratory staff. Okay, and this may happen up front if you're working with a vendor and say, hey, I only have X amount of dollars. They'll say, that's fine, buy our licenses, we'll do this, but you're responsible for all of that. And that may be everything from configuring methods, static data, maybe writing reports. I've seen it where they've put integration, vendors have put integration on the shoulders of the laboratory. And that means usually the outcome is one of two things. Either A, it doesn't get done in a timely manner because people in the lab have other things to do, or B, it is saddled with somebody saddled with that doesn't have the skill set to do it. Either way, the outcome is not typically good. So what do we suggest how to avoid this? If you need to get a budget number before you go out looking, perform a business case analysis prior to doing that. And that typically, again, is define the goals and objectives of what you're trying to do. Okay. Describe the benefits to the organization, because you're going to have to present this business case to somebody, in the management or somebody that can write a check. So you'll need to describe, okay, we want to spend this money. Here's what the benefits will be to the organization. Develop an accurate cost model. And when you do that, just make sure you take into consideration external costs. So this would be cost to the vendor or a third party, as well as internal costs. Okay. So if you're going to allocate people within the organization, there's a cost associated with that. Make sure that that is documented. And also describe and be able to articulate, because you'll get asked, how the LIMS will be able to drive value to the organization. In the past, a lot of companies talk about ROI, return on investment. So I'm going to spend this amount of money. When will I see my return on that investment? And that number is still used to a certain extent. But really, more companies now are looking at it from a perspective of, okay, we're going to take on this endeavor. We're going to spend this amount of money. What value will we get out of that? And there's ways to do that. We typically, counsel our clients to take a value engineering approach, where you outline what the LIMS will do, what the features will be, and how that aligns back to the company's key performance indicator, whether that is finance-based or maybe quality-based. There's a whole process around this, which really will show management, we're going to do this, and this is how the company is going to benefit. Just kind of as an aside, we'll be doing a webinar on value engineering and how to show value by implementing systems in an upcoming webinar. And again, seek assistance. Not everybody has done a business case, whether within the organization and part of the LIMS team or other parts of the organization. So if you don't have that experience, again, reach out to people that have had that. Doing this up front, getting the right amount of money will make the project go much, much smoother. Okay, moving on. Top mistake number 3, dictating the timeline to the vendor. And what I mean by this is that we've had clients, I've seen projects where they have told the vendor when a project must be complete, whether that's in a meeting, sometimes it goes out in an RFP that says, we want to do all of this, here's our scope, and oh, it must be done in 6 months. It's always 6, 9, and 12 months. You never see 7 months in 1 week, right? So that really goes to show that there's probably nothing behind that time frame other than they think that that's when it should be done. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes a project will have a constraint that where it must be done in a time frame, either for something going out of maintenance, for example. It may be a company not supporting something any longer, or maybe another system is being implemented and the two have to match up. A lot of times it's an arbitrary number. What happens with this is then the vendor or you and the vendor typically have a tendency to work backwards when developing a project plan. So we'll say, okay, if it's 6 months, we'll put a line in the sand 6 months out, and we'll start building all the tasks backwards. And what you typically do then is you take the time frame for those tasks and you mold it so that it meets that time frame. And really now you have artificial dates on all of your tasks. I've seen this many, many, many times. And really what the outcome of this is, several. First of all, it's just a distraction overall, because the team, the LIMS team, will spend more time managing the false plan than focusing on the project at hand. And really, kind of the ironic thing is that there's a perception that the project is failing, and it is. But if you look at it, and we've seen this, where if you put the project plan in place the way it should have been, maybe the task that you had given 2 weeks for is really a 2-month task, and you've completed it in a month and a half. Well, you're doing pretty well based on an actual or real project plan, but based on something that's artificial, it looks like it's failing, and now all eyes are on it even more. Typically what happens when you're in this situation is you get a project reboot. You'll go through evaluating the project plan, and you'll reallocate resources, and you'll reforecast, and it just doesn't work. And typically somebody calls stop. That's either somebody on the project team or maybe somebody up in management says, let's go back and start to do this the right way. But now you're down the path, you spent some money, and now you're going into a redo mode. How do you avoid this? Collaborate with the vendor, okay? When you start to get involved with a vendor, make sure they're involved from a couple of different perspectives. First off, provide a detailed scope to the vendor, okay? Make sure they understand very succinctly what you're trying to do, what your requirements are. And then, rather than provide the timeline to the vendor, ask the vendor to provide the timeline first, okay? Say, hey, here's what we want to do, here's our scope, tell us how long you think this is going to be. If it matches up with your timeline, great, you can proceed. But if not, then align the scope with the timeline that the vendor gave you. Either cut scope, do it for different phases. There's a variety of different ways to meet a deadline if it's a hard deadline and still get what you want. It may not happen all at once. You may have to reset expectations with certain groups there. But again, doing it this way, the project will go much smoother, and it would be considered a success and not a failure. Now you're probably starting to see a theme here. Again, if the experience isn't there, or maybe you're not feeling comfortable with how a vendor is putting together a scope for you, a timeline, seek assistance. Again, the time you put up front, making sure that this is correct, will save a lot of headaches in the long run.
And if you like, we can launch that next poll. Yep.
Sure.
Yeah, so as we're transitioning over into the next section, we'd like to launch another poll. How was your current LIMS selected? So there's 3 choices: an informal process, a formal process using internal resources, or a formal process with help from a third party. Again, we'll leave this up for about 5 or 6 seconds so we can gather a fair amount of results, and we'll share those with you in just a second. Great, we'll go ahead and close it, and then we'll share those results. So 48% formal process using internal, and then an even tie between an informal and formal process with help from a third party. Again, we want to thank you for participating in that, so we'll go ahead and hide that and pass it back to you, Rob.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Okay, 2 more to go. Top mistake number 2, selecting a LIMS solely on the current state of an organization. And what I mean by this is you're really looking at the LIMS from a current snapshot. So if you can get some kind of futuristic camera, take a picture of your company and saying, okay, we're going to get a LIMS to do exactly what we're doing right now. And typically, what this results in is you ignore any future technology enhancements or potential business needs. We hear this a lot, right now it's around cloud computing. We'll be talking to a client, we'll ask them about this, and they'll say, oh, no, we don't have a cloud strategy, we're kind of a risk-adverse company, we don't think we're going to go that route, so we're basically going to ignore it and sweep it under the rug. And we tell a story. We say, if you really think back, and it's really not that far, but we used to hear the same thing about the web, just the regular old internet, where companies said, oh, we don't have the internet in the lab, it doesn't make any sense, there's security concerns. Well, now it's almost impossible to do business without the internet. We heard it with electronic signatures as well. And now these are just generally accepted technology. So even though, for example, if your company does not have a cloud strategy and maybe there's some resistance against it, 5 years from now, it'll probably be a different story. Same thing with business needs. Right now, if you're doing a certain type of work, that's not to say that down the road you won't expand the business, you won't merge with a company, you won't purchase a company, and you need to keep these things in mind. And really what will happen if you don't is you'll be forcing the new LIMS into the mold of a legacy LIMS, or into a paper-based process. And we talk to clients about this a lot, saying that when you implement the LIMS, the goal is not to replicate the paper-based process you have now, but to implement a system that's really going to take you to the next level. So what's typically the outcome? You're going to select and implement LIMS with a limited lifespan. And you'll be repeating the process that you went through in the not too distant future. We've seen it where companies have put LIMS in, and in 24 months, maybe a little bit longer, they're thinking about replacing it because now things have changed either from a technical or a business perspective. How to avoid that? perform what we call a phase zero, also known as a strategic informatics report or a strategic LIMS roadmap, where really before you get started, you kind of step back, you take a breath, and you say, okay, where do we want this LIMS to go, or where do we think this will go over the next 3, 5, 7 years? And how this is typically done, get down on paper what you're doing now. Because a lot of times, you'll stare at that paper and say, I really don't know how to put the strategic plan together. Well, we'll start with what you know, right? Document what your current state looks like. And then define that future state. Try to project where that happens. You typically can't do this alone. If you're the leader of the LIMS project, or maybe if you're the team that would be responsible for doing the implementation, you're really going to need input from the entire organization. So that's going to be from IT. Where are we going to go technology-wise? Management certainly should be involved in this. From a standpoint of, hey, this is where we think we want to be as a company 3, 5, 7 years from now. And I always think it's great to talk to customers. Where are they going to be 3, 5, 7 years from now? So you can align with them and be able to support them as their business grows and changes. And surprise, surprise, if again there's not a lot of experience doing this, or you've never done it before, a lot of questions, certainly seek assistance out there. We do this a lot, and can certainly help out and provide guidance when necessary. Okay, last one. Top number one mistake that we talk about and we preach a lot is selecting a LIMS on features and not requirements of the company. And this really comes down to maybe evaluating it based solely on a demonstration, whether that's you invited a vendor in, you saw it at a trade show, on online, whatever it may be. But it's based on really looking at and the bells and whistles of it that drive the decision. And I get it, I understand it, because these days with the technology tools and where LIMS are and where they've come from over the years, there's a lot of nice features in many of the modern LIMS systems out there. Many that will make your life easy, and will really make you show well internally or to customers. But really, what that makes you do is overlook kind of the boring but important points of a LIMS systems. Percent RSDs and how they're calculated, is not going to get a lot of people excited. But when you talk about dashboards or alerts and mobile capabilities, and I can get all of this on my phone, that's typically what excites people. However, if you don't have the boring points, quote unquote, buttoned up, you'll have a tendency to fail. So what's the outcome if you do it this way? A lot of times those gaps, those boring points that you overlooked, you'll identify those during the implementation, and that's not where you want to identify, because typically that requires a stop. It requires okay, how are we going to solve this? If the LIMS system does not have that functionality, now you have to build it somehow, and it really can take a project and put a stop on it and drive up the timeline and the cost. Really what happens is you get a highly compromised implementation. People say, okay, well, that's good enough. And with that good enough, this is where you get not meeting the objectives of the project, or you have to keep manual processes around, in order to close gaps. So how to avoid? Plain and simple. Take the time and perform a proper LIMS requirements phase, okay? And, it really starts with just establishing stakeholder groups. Okay, make sure you look at and speak with and talk to all aspects of your organization, not just people that will be using it or people that are in the laboratories. Take the time. It's an iterative process, right? It's not just sitting in the room for one meeting, writing a couple of things on a whiteboard, and then off you go. It will take time, to meet with groups, meet with them again, and really get those requirements the right level of granularity. And certainly evaluate all requirements. A lot of times we focus on the functional requirements, I get that, but there's a lot of other requirements that you need to look at. Technical requirements, security requirements, etc. Make sure you take a look at all of those. And again, if it's something that either you don't have the time to do, the resources aren't available, or maybe the skill set, seek assistance in doing that. And this is number one, because this is typically what we see if a project didn't go well, or we're working with a client on a replacement. A lot of times it boils down to that, because typically requirements will look something like this. And whatever you do, don't do this. Now, this is an example that I mocked up, obviously, for today. This is my chicken scratch. But we see requirements like this, maybe not, handwritten, typed out, but really, really high level. And we'll get involved, and clients will call us up and say, hey, we just collected these requirements. Can you take a look at them before we proceed? So we'll get them. And that number one there is usually the one that's always number one, must be user-friendly. That's the number one that I would say 9 times out of 10 that we see. And then you see other high-level requirements, like it needs sample management, needs ad hoc reports, et cetera. And typically what you'll look at these and we'll evaluate them and say, every LIMS system out there can meet this, or we'll be able to show in some way, shape, or form that they can meet this. But this is not where you want to be. At the end of the day, a proper requirements document or proper requirements matrix will look something like this. Okay, in a grid type format, we'll have a unique number, especially if you're in a regulated environment, because you're going to have to do validation, and this will become very important with trace matrices, et cetera. A description of that, decomposed to the right level. Okay, and that has a tendency maybe at times to be more of an art than a science, and we can help with that. What the category is, priority, et cetera. But you'll want something that looks like this. If you're a mid-sized organization, it's more than a page and a half, right? This will be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of requirements. 50, 60, 70. We've had them hundreds of pages long in big multi-facility organizations. But this will scale according to your needs, but it will be something very similar to this. Okay. Case study, and before we move on. We were working with a clinical diagnostic company, actually a company we just got involved with, and they are in the middle of replacing the LIMS. And we asked them a little bit about, well, how'd you go about selecting what you're about to throw out? And the first thing, I was meeting with one of the executives there, and he said, what we did is, first thing we did is we decided how much money we're going to have, so we obtained our budget. So that was mistake number 4. As he started to talk and explain, he said, I have a really good friend of mine that has been in the business a long time, similar company, and I met with him. We were in the same town traveling on business together, and had a conversation, and he recommended LIMS number X, mistake number 5. And strike 3, they brought the vendor in, they had a demonstration, they really liked what they saw. His words were very impressed. Didn't know systems could do that. Very, very, very high praise for the company. But at the end of the day, it turned out that it just was not meeting their needs. They struggled with the implementation. There was something that was supposed to be done, I think, in a little bit less than a year. It went going, about a year and a half. They had plans to implement in 4 of the laboratories throughout the U.S. It only got implemented in 1, and barely. And they're in the replacement now, and it's only been in 24 months. So really what they're going through now is a process that we're helping them with, to take them through that. But they spend a lot of time, they spend a lot of money going through it this way. Okay, Kevin, I think we have another poll before we move on.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So we'll go ahead and get this last one launched. So the question is, how likely are you to consider hiring a third party to assist with your LIMS selection? Not likely. You have internal resources. Very likely. Somewhat likely. Not likely. We don't have the budget for it. So these are just a couple of questions, obviously from Astrix point of view, who does help folks do a lot of LIMS selections. It's interesting for us to get people's perspective on what they think about bringing in external resources. It's important to note that one of the key roles that external resources will play is that phase 0, really kind of helping you get started in the right direction so that you're not ripping and replacing down the road. Let's all face it, software vendors want to sell you pretty much everything that they can possibly sell you. the phase zero approach is really meant to understand needs and alignment ahead of time, so that you're not buying everything, you're buying only what's needed to accomplish the goals. Okay, we'll go ahead and close that out and share the results with everybody. So 41% somewhat likely, 28 very, 23 not likely you have internal resources, and 8% not likely in that you don't have a budget. So again, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts with us, and we'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Rob, for the quick review.
Okay, in closing, and we'll open up for questions. Just to review what we talked about today. Really a mistake, number 5, buying on recommendation. How to avoid it, buy based on what your organization needs. Number 4, rather than beginning with a budget and then looking out, perform a business case analysis so that the number that you get is really an accurate number, and it puts you in the best position to succeed when you go out there to the market. Do not dictate the timeline to the vendor. Collaborate with them, provide the scope, ask them for a timeline, and if it doesn't align, work with them to make sure that your scope aligns with the allotted timeline. Look forward. Don't base it solely on what you're currently doing. Take into consideration where you may be technology-wise or business-wise down the road, and perform that phase zero, or as we call the the LIMS roadmap. And certainly, number 1, base it on your requirements. The features will come. If you cover your requirements, in modern LIMS systems, they have a lot of bells and whistles. So if you focus on the requirements, you'll get the features, and perform that detailed analysis to make sure that you do. So with that, that's all I have today. We'll open it up for any questions.
Well, first of all, Rob, thank you very much for the content. Very helpful. Very instructive, and certainly I think it's probably a number of case studies that you could have gone over in your career dealing with companies that have gone down a path of a mission-critical software implementation like this, only to find that they're ripping and replacing somewhere down the road. And certainly we see with the cloud technology and the need to have a fully integrated laboratory that folks are taking a harder look at bringing in outside help to really kind of help them get a handle on making sure whatever technology that they're putting in aligns with the corporate goals. So great content, and again, much appreciated. In terms of questions, so as I mentioned in the beginning, you can use the question panel on GoToWebinar, and we'll read the question. We won't read your name. We won't read your email address. We won't read your company. We keep that all confidential, of course. So there are a number of questions on the floor that I want to bring up. First one would be, how important do you consider the LIMS technology platform database when selecting a system?
Good question. I think that the database really depends. If your organization has very strict rules on technology, and some do, where they say we're a Microsoft shop, don't bring Oracle in here because we cannot support it. You may get that, and then it becomes very important. But often, what we counsel clients is that a database in a LIMS system a lot of times is compartmentalized. Okay, it's not like having just, we'll use Oracle as an example, where you have to tune it all the time. A lot of that happens within the LIMS system, so it becomes less important from a technology standpoint. It really comes down to if somebody in your IT organization is going to, bang their shoe on the table and say, we don't want this type of database in here. If not, then, if it's a SQL Server or Oracle, that'll be able to scale to your organization. Now, if you're talking about a LIMS that maybe has a Microsoft Access database, but you have multiple facilities, you probably don't want to go that route. So, if you select the system with the right database, then it should not have that much effect on it.
Great, appreciate that. I love this question. It's very broad, but it's great to get an expert like yours perspective on. SaaS LIMS, is it the right way to go?
SaaS LIMS is the right way to go. Again, is very broad and highly dependent on the organization, but there's a lot of advantages to that, right? Than having something that's on-prem, and we see more and more of it. So, to say yes, it's the right way to go, it's tough without knowing the organization, but here's what we always tell and counsel clients: take a look at it. okay? And we can help you, guide you on which ones are out there, because there's a lot of advantages to SaaS, as opposed to something that may be, on-prem.
Great. Let me go ahead here. We have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to go through and do them in order here. Interesting question. How important do you consider the vendor's financial health when selecting a system?
I mean, it's important. How important, it's tough to say, but if a vendor is not in a good financial state or a good business state, right? You got to realize that this is, when you select a vendor, you're going into a relationship, hopefully a long-term relationship with a vendor. So if a vendor is on rocky footing, to the extreme point where they may be out of business in a couple of years, well, that's a problem, because now they have obviously source code, escrow agreements, all that, but now you become the owner and of the source code, and you become a software company, which is probably where you don't want to be, right? So it's in our evaluations, it's something that we tell companies to look at. Certainly, and being in the marketplace, we can provide guidance on what that looks like. It's something that you certainly should consider.
Okay. Interesting question, Rob. Have you ever been involved with a project where the vendor did not deliver what was documented in the requirements or design specs, or a time when the vendor was consistently late based on recommended timelines suggested by the vendor? If so, how has your company handled such situations, or how have you handled such situations with a vendor?
That happens. We've seen it a lot. When we're involved from the beginning of a project, we avoid that by doing a couple of things. Setting out realistic timelines and goals, with the vendor, and that starts back where we'll get for example, a client of ours will get a quote from a vendor that has timelines or estimates and all of that, and we'll look at that immediately. And a lot of times we'll see things that just don't align right. Like we have seen where a vendor has quoted to do 15 custom reports, and difficult ones, and they have allowed it 5 business days to do it. It's not feasible, not going to happen, right? But the reason that you often see that is because vendors know they're in a competitive advantage with other vendors, and they don't like to give big numbers. I get that, right? But it has to be realistic. So we'll work with the client, go back to the vendor and say, hey, you bid 5 days here. This, maybe you didn't understand what we're trying to do. Let's get that aligned properly. So the important thing to avoid that is make sure that the scope and the schedule is aligned properly. What you also want to do is tie payment milestones to deliverables. Okay. I mean, vendors are, LIMS vendors are a business, they need cash flow like everybody else, right? So, what you want to do is to make sure that the payment is aligned with what they deliver, and you make sure that the milestones are close enough together. You don't want a vendor strung out for 6 months waiting for a check. Nobody does, right? So make sure that they are monthly or every other month, that something is being delivered, something measurable. You can check the box and say, okay, we've got this. It's in the bank. Here's your check. Did I answer that question, Kevin?
I believe so. Yes. Okay. Let me do this. Given the time, I want to select, try and go through maybe 2 more questions, but I think there's enough on here that what we'll do is we will come back to everybody with the document, because there's quite a few questions. Another thing I want to mention, there's been a couple of questions on, have you worked with this LIMS vendor or that LIMS vendor? We don't typically get into discussing a specific vendor in the Q&A section. We don't want to certainly come off as biased or in any way, shape, or form, or promote one vendor over another. So any of the vendor-related questions, we will definitely take those offline. Okay. We see a lot of LIMS implemented in the GXP environments. Is there a space for LIMS in discovery research, or do you end up being limited on flexibility by the product or the platform?
Well, that's an interesting question, because, right, LIMS systems are, a lot of them are GXP. You get into research, it gets into kind of a fuzzy area, only because, LIMS, LIMS a lot of the times are, sample-centric, right? Where, you're analyzing a sample and it kind of goes through a workflow or a series of workflow. Once you get into the research area, it's much more dynamic and fluid, and it's not necessarily following steps or a recipe, but you're doing something, and depending on the outcome of that, now you have to go, if an outcome is this, you go left. If the outcome is that, you go right, right? And sometimes LIMS can handle that. So, understanding, and then also data, right? LIMS is very good at handling and processing structured data, a result that has a unit, for example, as opposed to an observation, or something other, some other unstructured data that may be in research and development, a diagram or a drawing, for example. There are LIMS systems that do it better than others, or, maybe in that environment, a LIMS system is not the proper tool. Okay, and we've been called into projects where they say, hey, we're looking for a LIMS, can you help us? And we get in there and we'll say, hey, what you're really looking for here is an electronic lab notebook, or a scientific data management system. So maybe it started out where you thought you need a LIMS, but you're so unstructured and you need all this flexibility. Maybe LIMS isn't the right tool. Maybe it is with the right LIMS, but sometimes going and selecting another tool is the proper approach.
Great. I'm going to try to get this question across, and we'll make this the last one. Nothing has been mentioned on business process optimization or simplification, quote unquote, the lean approach. Is this also one of the reasons some projects are failing? And then there's a follow-on to this, so bear with me here. What about a combination of business process simplification and SaaS LIMS? Is this an efficient approach? You understand what's being asked, Rob?
So if I understand the first one about business process optimization as part of the LIMS selection process,
I believe, yeah, I believe that's what the person is going for. Nothing on business process optimization or simplification. The lean approach, I guess this is also one of the reasons some projects are failing.
Yeah, obviously this focused obviously on the selection, portion of that. Now, the business process optimization, there are times where we do this as part of the LIMS selection where we say, okay, let's go through and map out, your processes, and then let's go as we're doing the 2B environment, right? We'll do the as is first, we'll go to the 2B. Let's go through a business process optimization at that point. Or a company or clients of ours will take that as a separate project, and do that before we get involved in doing the selection. But to answer your question, it could be part of why LIMS systems fail. Yeah, certainly where, and even if we're not doing quote unquote a business process optimization part of it, as we go through and do a 2B environment, if things are just totally out of line, and that usually comes down to if you're going maybe from a manual system, a homegrown system, or something that's just not working for you. You don't want to replicate that in the new LIMS. So that needs to be obviously aligned and straightened out before you begin the process.
Great, appreciate that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and wrap and stop the recording.